Good afternoon. My name is Brian Dobling, and I'm with the Federal Highway Administration, Office of Infrastructure. I'm in the Office of Pre-Construction, Construction, and Pavements, and I work in the Pavement Design and Performance team along with Austin Jarrell. My title is a LCA and EPD Technical Specialist, but my primary responsibility is working with the FHWA Sustainable Pavements Program. Austin, you want to give a couple quick words about yourself?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Judy. So I'm on the exact same team in Federal Highway as Brian's, the Pavement Design and Performance team. I'm a student trainee. What I work on primarily is our initiatives in pavement resilience, and then also some work in pavement sustainability as well. I'm doing this while I'm a PhD student at West Virginia University studying pavement resilience with a civil engineering major. So thank you.
We go to the next slide. And this afternoon, we'll be talking a little bit more on our sustainable pavements and resilient pavement programs. Next slide, please. So this is our standard disclaimer that our legal folks ensure that we include in all of our presentations. It basically says that the contents of this presentation haven't any binding force or anything related to the effective law, and are purely for informational, and unless otherwise noted, they're not tied to any particular law or policy. Next slide, please. You'll find that in this space of sustainability and even resiliency, it's alphabet soup, lots and lots of acronyms. So some might look familiar, but if they don't, feel free to drop in the chat if you're looking for clarification. But here are some of the more common acronyms that we'll be using throughout the presentation. Next slide, please. So for this afternoon's webinar, we're going to go over why are we talking about this? What does it mean around the context of sustainability and specifically around sustainable pavements? How are sustainability and resiliency similar but also different? And then more specifically on pavement resiliency, Austin will be jumping into some more details there. We'll leave you with some resources that we have lots of resources out there available online and in other locations. And with time, we'll allow for some comment or questions. So if you do have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Otherwise, when we get through our presentation, we'll be happy to entertain any questions you may have. Next slide, please. And next one, please. So why are we talking about this? Well, it's no secret that we have a lot of disasters that are ongoing throughout the United States, more so than there have been in many, as long as we've been recording them. These disasters are coming at a higher intensity, with more frequency, and at a higher cost. So what this graph represents here is the impacts of these disasters that are occurring more often and with more intensity. That you can see that there's a lot of different types of disasters that are occurring. But the real takeaway from this graph is to show that these disasters have significant economic impacts, not only in the recovery and the reconstruction from the disasters, but also what these disasters do to supply chain and the cost of the materials that are used in the rebuilding or reconstruction of the disaster itself, but also the cost of those materials that are used in transportation projects around the country that may not have been in the location of the disaster, but feel the economic effects from a supply chain and just material cost perspective of these disasters happening more and more often. And with the United States government being the largest procurer of goods and services in the world, this has a lot of impact to our ability to procure goods and services. So it's something that the federal government is taking a much closer attention to these days. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we're getting more of these events that are happening more often with more intensity. A lot of agencies are looking at it from a perspective of resiliency, which is pun intended, the ability for infrastructure to weather the weather. But there is also a need to be able to look at the mitigation of the emissions that are causing these significant events. And that's where sustainability and resiliency are different, is that when we're looking at sustainability, we're looking at doing something upfront before, or trying to do something before these events occur, and to do something about the emissions that we know are causing these events. Next slide, please. So for the United States Department of Transportation, which both Austin and I are employees of, we have specific goals that have been identified in our strategic plan, specifically around climate and sustainability. And that is to reduce these greenhouse gas emissions and transportation related pollution to build more resilient and sustainable transportation systems. So when we're talking from that larger federal government perspective in the U.S. Department of Transportation, we're not just talking about pavements, and we're talking about how that affects the entire transportation system. But as we start to go through this presentation, I'm going to go from that larger federal perspective and trying to drill down more specifically into pavements. Next slide, please. So specifically to Federal Highway Administration, which is a mode of transportation within the U.S. Department of Transportation, this slide is around what we're hoping to be releasing soon is from our updated pavement design policy, which is that our task is to ensure that pavements are designed, constructed, preserved, and maintained to accommodate current predicted traffic needs. And that's all stuff we've been talking about for a long time. But now we're putting a lot more emphasis on, we need to be considering the economic, environmental, and social impacts and burdens throughout an entire pavement's life cycle. So this graph on the right represents the different program areas within the Federal Highway Administration, and specific to the team that Austin and I are both members of in the pavement design and performance team. These program areas represent the life cycle of a pavement, from design and the materials used, QA, construction, on through to pavement preservation and rehabilitation. The important thing about this graph is it shows that it took a lot of discussion and collaboration, but we've come to agreement that sustainable pavements, which is a program area of FHWA, touches every one of these program areas as well, which is why it's at the center of this wheel. And I would even argue, to provoke your thoughts a bit, that if you took out the term pavements and just put in, the design of a project, the materials used in a project, the construction of a project, or the pavement or the rehabilitation and preservation of a project, you can see how sustainability is much more than just something focused around pavements. But that's where we're at today, is we're really focusing in on pavements because it's an area we can kind of get our arms better wrapped around. Next slide, please. So what does it mean to be a sustainable pavement? Well, about 12 years ago, states were getting approached more often by vendors and suppliers saying, hey, we got this really green product that you should be using on your projects. And it's the greenest thing you've ever seen. You need to use it. And states are like, well, what does that even mean to be green or sustainable? So states approached FHWA and said, what does FHWA think about that? And FHWA is like, well, we don't have a formal opinion at this time, and we are going to start a sustainable pavements program. So that was the impetus of starting the Sustainable Pavements Program over 12 years ago, to really get an understanding of what is the state of practice, what's been going on around pavements specifically, and sustainability. From that effort in the early years of the Sustainable Pavements Program, a lot of research was done to determine that state of practice. And one of the outcomes was this document you see here in the graph, or the picture on the left. And that was a Towards Sustainable Pavement Systems reference document that was published in 2015. Within that document, it talks to these 4 major highlights of what it means to be a sustainable pavement. First and foremost, it must achieve the engineering goals. At no point are we ever trying to promote sustainability at the loss or at the sacrifice of performance. We know that if you don't have a pavement that doesn't last and that needs to be replaced or rehabbed more often, then that's not sustainable. That's just not good performance. Second characteristic of a sustainable pavement is that it preserves and ideally restores surrounding ecosystems. That's something that's a bit of a unusual concept, but that's something we're working more and more on, is like, what can our pavements do to not just lessen the impact, but also improve the surrounding ecosystems of our pavements? Third is nothing new. We've been talking about using financial, human, and environmental resources wisely for a long time. But the fourth is a kind of building upon that, which is that we want to make sure that pavements are meeting those basic human needs, such as health, safety, equity, employment, comfort, and happiness, so that all Americans have the ability to go to work, go to church, go to the grocery store with the same quality pavements that are safe and dependable. Next slide, please. So how do we do this? That's a great reference to guide, but how do we ensure that? Well, we do that through what we're defining as the balance of the triple bottom line. We talked about, we're familiar with that economic side of things. Many folks may be familiar with that life cycle cost analysis perspective, in which Federal Highways has been working in that space for a long time in development of tools such as real costs. We've also been working more and more on the social side of our impacts of our decisions and pavements. And there's a tool out there that also helps to quantify those impacts, and that's called Invest. And then what we're going to speak more specifically today on, and we're putting more and more emphasis in, is that the environmental impacts of our transportation and pavement decisions. So Federal Highways has developed another tool around life cycle assessment, and that tool is called LCA Pave, which is allows for the use of analyzing of multiple different alternatives throughout a pavement's life cycle. And a key component to that analysis is what we're also going to talk about today, environmental product declarations. These EPDs can be uploaded into LCA Pave to help get a better understanding of and quantifying of our transportation and pavement decisions. But at the heart of all these balance of this economic, social, and environmental factors is performance. Continues to be we want to ensure that we're getting the performance out of our pavements that are defined by our engineering goals. Next slide, please. So some quick takeaways as it relates to sustainability and what we promote through the Sustainable Pavements Program. As you can see from the previous slide, sustainability is not just about environmental impacts. There are other factors that need to be considered. And as part of that, sustainability is very, very context sensitive. There's a lot of times we'll be posed with the question is, which is more sustainable, this or that? And it really comes down to, what are we talking about? What is the context of what we're talking about? One important factor that we're really promoting and why it's the importance of EPDs is you can't improve what you don't measure. Many states and the federal government as a whole have specific targets that we're trying to meet, such as net zero by 2050. You can't get to a goal like that without knowing where you're at today and where you need to go so you can monitor and track your performance and how you're going to get there. As mentioned previously, life cycle analysis is not the same as life cycle cost analysis. One is related to more the economic factors, and the life cycle assessment is related to the environmental impacts of our decisions. A big takeaway here is that if our pavements don't meet the intended performance, it can't be sustainable. And that comes down to sustainability is just good engineering. Next slide, please. So what is this life cycle assessment, LCA, that I mentioned before? It's a systematic analysis of the potential environmental impacts of a product or material throughout their entire life cycle. This graph on the right represents what that looks like in what is considered to be ISO, International Standards Organization, standards as to how you define that life cycle. So when we talk about A1 through A3, you'll hear us talk about that often, and that's related to the production or taking a material out of the ground and what it takes to transport it to a processing manufacturing facility. And then finally, say, for example, in the context of an asphalt pavement, taking the binder out of the ground in A1, transporting it to your facility of a refinery, or then on to your batch plant. And then A3 would be the manufacturer of your asphalt mixture, for example. So as I mentioned before, life cycle cost analysis is your financial accounting. Life cycle assessment is your eco or ecological environmental accounting. So by standardizing using these standards that are defined by ISO and these steps and these processes, we can quantify in each one of these steps what the impacts are throughout an entire life cycle of a pavement or material. Next slide, please. A key consideration as part of our life cycle analysis often has to do with the information that can be communicated as part of environmental product declarations. You may have heard this term EPDs quite a bit recently. It's not a medical term. It's a term that was developed and standardized many years ago in other countries to help provide a means for industry to communicate its environmental impacts of a material or product. It's an expression of the results of a life cycle assessment that we talked about in the previous slide. These EPDs are developed not in a vacuum. They are developed with stakeholder input that goes into the development of a product category rule that includes a product category PCR committee, where those inputs are provided from not just the industry, but also the agency and user perspective, so that we're getting a good representation of what these environmental impacts are of our material. You'll hear some folks describe it as a similar to a nutritional label for a food product. It's similar but different in the sense that it provides those, instead of nutritional information, it provides that environmental information as to a material or product in a specific context around that material. Next slide, please. So for our FHWA Sustainable Pavements Program, here are some of the key initiatives that we're working on currently. There's an executive order 14057 that was issued a few years ago that specified that net zero federal procurement goal, as I mentioned, by 2050 to be net zero. That's been kind of our marching orders that put forth the efforts that are ongoing with the establishment of a Buy Clean task force that not only is limited, isn't only limited to FHWA and the Sustainable Pavements Program, but includes all the other modes of government that are trying to work towards net zero in our federal procurement. Because as I mentioned, the United States federal government is the world's largest procurer of goods and services, and we have a big impact in our decisions that we need to do a better job of quantifying and tracking and monitoring of our decisions. Federal Highways was tapped to initiate a climate challenge program. Since Federal Highway Administration's Sustainable Pavements Program had been around working in this area, we were tasked with standing up the Climate Challenge program and implementing it, which provided the opportunity to states and local agencies to explore the use of life cycle assessment and environmental product declarations. And we got an overwhelming response with 25 states and 2 local agencies participating, in which we've been able to award over $7 million to those agencies to explore the use of LCA and EPDs. Meanwhile, we've had an ongoing parallel initiative in the Everyday Counts Cycle 7, which for those that may not be familiar with EDC, it's Everyday Counts is a states-based model that takes proven yet underutilized innovations and provides the opportunity for state agencies to take it into more standard practice. So for Cycle 7, environmental product declarations for sustainable project delivery was selected, and we've been doing a lot of efforts with participation of a number of states around EPDs. Finally, the big elephant that we've been working on is the Inflation Reduction Act and a $2 billion program for low carbon transportation material grants. And we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. Next slide, please. So that executive order I mentioned was signed in September of 21, stood up the Buy Clean Task Force. A year later, there was a policy statement specific to Buy Clean, which for those that aren't familiar with what Buy Clean is, it's a green public procurement strategy. And it's that the United States version of a green public procurement strategy here in the United States. Many, many countries around the world have been doing green public procurement for many years. And here in the United States, we're just getting started. And what we're terming as green public procurement is Buy Clean here in the United States. And that's to leverage our federal procurement power to catalyze markets for low carbon construction materials as we're upgrading U.S. transportation infrastructure. And that's as a direct result of the bipartisan infrastructure law. The pollutant that we're recommending for tracking is greenhouse gas emissions, and we're focusing that around these 4 priority materials in asphalt, concrete, flat glass, and steel, as they are the materials known to be the highest, with the highest greenhouse gas intensity. And the tool for which we're going to monitor and track that is environmental product declarations. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the Climate Challenge program was stood up in 2022 in a very short time, and was announced on April 22nd, 2022 on Earth Day. And we were able to get an overwhelming response. And like I mentioned, the states were interested in use of LCA and EPDs, and to help understand how they could use this analysis and this information to become a standard practice in informing pavement material and design selection, as well as enhancing sustainable pavement practices, as we're quantifying the emissions and impacts of those practices. So we announced our participants back in October of 2022, and the participants have been working through implementation of their projects that they were selected to, that they had identified, and we're helping to support. We've also been going through and providing customized training to those Climate Challenge participants, and to provide some of these fundamental understandings as it relates to life cycle assessment and environmental product declarations. This program is starting to wind down here this fall, but the projects themselves will continue on through into completion. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we've had a parallel effort in the Everyday Counts Cycle 7 initiative for EPDs for sustainable project delivery. The agencies that are participating in this EDC effort have access to specific examples of what sorts of contract and specification language might be used for helping to collect EPDs, or how to stand up a EPD process within their agency. What materials you might want to consider. Some are, though we identified there are 4 priority materials, not all agencies are moving forward with use of all 4 of those materials. Some have local legislation that requires what materials they need to be collecting EPDs on. Others are just trying to dip their toes into this space. And so some are specific to only a singular material, where others may be upwards of 5 or more. There's information available on how to database, where to store this information, what sorts of tools and best practices are currently being implemented by other agencies. And it's helping folks understand how EPDs can be used, not just within the pavements materials world, but also throughout the entire project delivery process. Next slide, please. So this is just a map of those participating agencies from across the country. As I mentioned, a large representation from across the country, coast to coast and throughout the interior of the United States, including Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia. Next slide, please. So how are a lot of these agencies planning to move forward in the future around these subject of life cycle assessment and environmental product declarations? Well, the Low Carbon Transportation Materials Program that's been made available through the Inflation Reduction Act is providing a big opportunity for states and agencies to move forward with continuing to implement and put into standard practice the use of LCA and EPDs. Next slide, please. So what is this LCTM program? It's a grant program that is for eligible projects that include materials and products that have been determined to have substantially lower levels of embodied greenhouse gas emissions. Now, what's interesting about this program is that definition of substantially lower levels of embodied greenhouse gas emissions is being established and described by the Environmental Protection Agency, but Federal Highways has been assigned to administer this grant program. Again, we're focusing in on these eligible materials of concrete and cement, glass, asphalt mix, and steel. Funds are available for use on Title 23 construction projects. For those that may not be familiar with what Title 23 reference, that's the authority of federal highways to provide funding to state agencies and what are considered to be projects or efforts on the national highway system. So those types of projects can include as I mentioned, federal aid highways, tribal transportation facilities, federal lands transportation facilities, as well as federal lands access transportation facilities. Next slide, please. So the program has been broken into two big components. There is a portion that the $1.2 billion that's available specific for state departments of transportation. That request for application was announced earlier this year, and those applications were due on June 10th, a month ago. We are currently in the process of reviewing those applications, and we are anticipating award of these grants in September of 2024. We also have a large chunk that has been identified for non-state DOTs. $800 million has been set aside for those municipalities and local agencies that will have an opportunity through a different mechanism in a more traditional sense of a notice of funding opportunity. This NOFO will be available on grants.gov and is anticipated to be announced very soon. A key note for both of these components is that all the funds must be obligated by September of 2026 and are available for expenditure through September 30th of 2031. So as you can see, there's a lot of opportunity for a lot of different agencies, but there are a timeline that needs to be met with all these funds being expended by 2031. Sounds like a long time, but we got a lot of work to do to get that done in that time frame. Next slide, please. So I'm trying to bring it all together here as to what FHWA is working on as far as what our goals are for sustainable transportation infrastructure. And we look at it in this sort of pyramid perspective. At the base of the pyramid, we're educating and promoting agencies for the use of life cycle assessment and environmental product declarations. And Federal Highway, specifically in the Sustainable Pavements Program, is doing that through the Climate Challenge Program and EDC 7 and EPDs for Sustainable Project Delivery. We have this great opportunity of $2 billion through the Low Carbon Transportation Materials Grant Program that provides that opportunity to incentivize and to pilot projects for agencies that are wanting to do more with these concepts and to actually get these materials in use on construction projects. Finally, at the top of the pyramid this is all setting the stage for the opportunity that there may be at some point, I can't say for sure, but there may be that coming in the future of a federal buy clean, where that could be a policy or a mandate established by the federal government. If that were to never come to be, there are already many states that have implemented and passed buy clean legislation within the respective states, as well as many local agencies that too have already established policies and mandates within their local jurisdictions. So Federal Highways and Sustainable Pavements Program continues to educate, incentivize, and pilot these low carbon transportation materials for the opportunity to implement buy clean processes within agencies. Next slide, please. And I'll hand it over to Austin to provide a little bit more perspective on the similarities and differences between sustainability and resilience.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, as Brian alluded to, he gave a great initial discussion on sustainability and resilience, two strategies that are essential to what we do on the pavement design and performance team at FHWA in regards to mitigating and adapting to climate change. And I'll just quickly go through some delineations we like to make and go over resilience efforts that we have. So next slide, please. So first of all, it's good to call out explicitly resilience and sustainability are not the same in terms of pavement design, pavement management. And on this slide, you can see some examples of resilient pavement practices, sustainable pavement practices, and those that may be common. First, for resilience, it's important to design for catastrophic events. In some cases, maybe over designing, such as sacrificial roadways. Also, it's important to use climate adaptive materials in unsustainable circumstances. Maybe you're employing these materials in a case where you wouldn't typically apply these to the rest of your network, but you need to use them anyway to be resilient. For sustainable pavement design practices, it's things that Brian talked about, using recycled materials, integration of pavement preservation and pavement management, addressing social impacts of paving activities, and also exploring LCCAs and LCA. But there are a few common practices that you can consider as well, such as the use of porous pavements, as well as design and management that incorporates future climate conditions. And that really is important when we consider the next few slides. So next slide. So the reason that it's important to consider future climate in design and management is because while we know that resilient solutions may or may not be sustainable, resilient systems as a whole contribute to higher confidence and performance, given disruptions, given the need for adaptation, which therefore can help the cause for sustainability. As well as we know that sustainable systems address the need for resilience, right? Because sustainability is all focused on climate mitigation or reducing the negative outputs of our practices that can contribute to future climate change. So these strategies do go hand in hand, even though they're not the same. Next slide. And it's important to consider these because while we need resilience to withstand extreme weather events, again, we need sustainability to mitigate climate change as it stands now. Again, both strategies are focused on climate change, at least in the case of climate change resilience. So it's important to have them working hand in hand. Next slide. So now I'll go over a deeper dive in pavement resilience in general. So what's the motivation for it at FHWA, and what's the current state of practice, as well as some activities that we're working on. Next slide. So first of all, we'll start with the definition. Pavement climate resilience, very specific definition of resilience. That's adapted from FHWA Order 5520, as well as further defined in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So there are two portions of this definition that I purposely separated. The first is the ability of a pavement to anticipate, prepare for, and adapt to changing conditions while maintaining the performance that you're expecting, your expected pavement performance, right? And this is more focused on gradual changes in the frequency and intensity of climate stressors, such as increasing temperature, increasing precipitation. It's taking a general approach in a design process to account for this. Now, the second portion of the definition is more focused on rapid disruptions or rapid recovery from extreme disruptions. So it's to withstand, respond to, and recover rapidly from disruptions. And what disruptions? Extreme weather events, and also instituting rapid assessment and repair practices, such as in the case where you have a road that is washed out. Do you have mechanisms in place or novel strategies to get that road repaired very quickly, more quickly than you might typically expect? Next slide. And so here are a few impacts from climate that we're concerned with for pavements. So beginning, we already know that there are two contributing factors to account for with pavement performance: environmental factors and loading from trucks. Now, for environmental factors, a Turner Fairbank Highway Research Center study from 2016 for a few sites in Pennsylvania noted that in their analysis that the environmental factors rather contributed to 36% of total damage for flexible pavements and 24% of total damage for rigid pavements. Now, we already knew that environmental factors were a key consideration, but this is why it matters in the terms of climate change resilience. Because with changes in climate, we can characterize these in terms of changes in the frequency and intensity of temperature, precipitation, droughts, floods, wildfires, Arctic change, sea level rise, and extreme weather events. Therefore, it's important to account for these because these actually expose vulnerabilities in pavements that have associated levels of risks for decreases in pavement performance that you might not expect. What are these decreases? What are these indicators of pavement performance decreases, you might ask? Well, on the right, we can see different ones for asphalt and concrete pavements specifically. So with asphalt, you might see more rutting of the asphalt surface, more block cracking, more fatigue cracking. With concrete, more blowups for JPCP, as well as slab cracking and slab warping. It's not to say that these indicators can't already be seen normally in your design and management routines, but with increases in climate change, with increases in the frequency and intensity of climate stressors, these could lead to premature failures that you're not expecting, that you could try to monitor for and account for in either design or management processes. Next slide. And so I also wanted to note that these pavement climate vulnerabilities are also context specific. Your part of the nation, there might be more vulnerability to specific climate stressors. Some may have greater weight. For the example of temperature, I pulled this from a recent report, the Federal Highway Pavement Resilience State of Practice. If you start with the category of temperature, you can discern 4 climate stressors. And if you look at just the climate stressor of a higher extreme maximum temperature, you can get a few associated vulnerabilities that you could look for with that. What's not included here is also in the same table this information is pulled is a set of common adaptation options or strategies for each of these climate categories and relevant stressors. And I'll talk more about that report later. But addressing this vulnerability, context specific as it is, means measuring and quantifying and adapting to risk, right? Very similar to sustainability in that way, where resilience is focused on what you can measure and quantify and the change that you can implement in your existing practices. Next slide. And then I'll go over the resilience motivation like Brian went over the sustainability motivation. So in terms of what federal highways should be doing, you need to look at the strategic goal or the strategic plan that we have for federal highway, and specifically the goal that Brian mentioned, climate sustainability. Now, for infrastructure resilience, there are a few relevant objectives. One is to enhance data collection and analysis to assess risks posed by climate change to the transportation system and identify vulnerable infrastructure assets. So goal 1, and pavements are certainly a part of that. Goal 2 is to research and advance, or sub-goal, sorry, is to research and advance the adoption of adaptable, resilient materials and structures. Pavements fits under that as well. And then if you look at the Climate Justice and Environmental Justice Initiative, it's to establish data collection and analysis methods to assess the risk posed by climate change to vulnerable communities and the transportation systems that serve them. So again, from the standpoint of the strategic goals and the strategic plan, it's focused on identification, quantification, measurement of vulnerability, and adoption of resilient materials and structures. That's kind of the, to sum it up, right? So again, we need to be quantifying these and coming up with solutions. Next slide. And it's also important that we're conducting research to deploy strategies for improving pavement resilience. This is in our plan as well. One example of this could be to account for the impact of increasing temperature on flexible pavement infrastructure. If you wanted to do that, that'd require quantification in pavement design and management. That's by the way, that's just one example and not indicative of the scope of the strategic plan. But if you wanted to do this, if you wanted to engage in this measurement, you'd have to use climatic data. It's not always the case that climatic data is explicitly used in pavement design and management. But even with common methods today that use this climate data, they typically assume climate stationarity. Now, what does climate stationarity mean? It's the assumption that observed climate, or the observed data that we have for use in our tools, is indicative of future climate. Now, we know from places like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change at the United Nations that a lot of this has been modeled to say that we can model simulated climate without the presence of human activities, and it's different from our observed record. So this sort of scientific evidence really places the assumption into doubt, is to say that perhaps a different assumption we could operate on is that observed data or the observed record is not indicative of future climate, and we should find a way to account for this data in our processes and see if there are differences in pavement performance that we could point to change our design and management strategies. Next slide. So now that we've gone over kind of the basis of pavement resilience from the perspective of FHWA, I'll talk to you a little bit about ongoing initiatives and resources that we're engaged in, partially in order to address the mandates set out for us in the Federal Highway Strategic Plan and US DOT Strategic Plan, but also our initiatives to build and disseminate current knowledge. Brian mentioned that the Sustainable Pavements Program has been engaged in this sustainability work since roughly 2011. With pavement resilience, we really started picking this up for pavement specifically around 2020. So we're still very much in the building knowledge and education phase. So next slide, please. So the first project I'll mention is the impact of wildfires on pavements. Brian showed the slide at the beginning of this presentation that showed increases in billion-dollar disasters, and wildfires are actually in that criteria. We've seen them increasing around California, especially. Last summer, there were even wildfires where I'm from in West Virginia, which is not something we typically expect. So it's definitely becoming more of a concern for pavements. But this project specifically was built to determine the state of knowledge in regards to wildfire impacts on pavements, identify direct and indirect impacts, such as the impacts of the heat from these fires impacting pavements, as well as increases in traffic loading that result from not only increases in the frequency of traffic loading, but also the loads themselves as a result of debris clearing, and identify research gaps and needs in order to further the state of knowledge and further what we can do about this. The project deliverables are most importantly identifying how state DOTs that were in the study have dealt with the issue already, including detailed interviews and experiences, observations, and challenges. And that's on that one. Next slide. Now, the other one is the Assessing Flooded Pavements project. This one is a little bit older, and we've actually concluded this now, but it's to develop methods to assess flooded pavements. Specifically, how does the capacity to carry traffic change during and after flooding, especially after long periods of inundation? If you place normal traffic on pavements that are still saturated after inundation, it can really accelerate the degradation in pavement performance. Therefore, it's important to try to assess when it's best to apply traffic again. As a result of this flooded pavements project, FHWA actually put together 2 tech briefs, and those should be coming out shortly on our pavement resilience website. If you search Resilient Pavements FHWA, they'll be posted there. You can monitor for that. Next slide, please. And then also the NOAA Effects of Sea Level Rise project. This is a joint project with the National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science. And the goal of this is to inform adaptation planning and coastal management decisions through a comprehensive research program that uses dynamic physical and biological processes to develop models capable of evaluating the vulnerability and resilience of sea level rise for pavements. Next slide. And there are 2 focus areas of this program. So the first is coastal resilience, the second is surface transportation resilience. Again, the goal is quantification. I quantify the vulnerability of surface transportation systems to sea level rise and inundation, as well as quantify social, economic, or ecological benefits to addressing this vulnerability. So you can see here, there's kind of a merge of sustainability and resilience just in this project alone to further underscore that these topics are used in unison for pavement applications. Also, to predict the effects of sea level rise and inundation on surface transportation infrastructure under varying risk mitigation and management strategies. And again, this project is ongoing. Next slide. I mentioned this earlier, the Pavement Resilience State of Practice report. This was actually the result of 2 national peer exchange meetings where we talked about strategies and barriers for designing, constructing, and maintaining more resilient pavements, as well as research that was needed in the future that's actually informed a lot of our current research projects. Now, this pavement resilience document goes over approaches and strategies for resilience, gaps in research needs, and really it's a good benchmark for the state of the practice today. And we'll have more research projects based on this coming out of our new Sustainability and Resilient Pavement Cooperative Agreement, but I'll mention that shortly. Next slide. So ongoing and upcoming dissemination items. I mentioned FHWA has a Resilient Pavements website. This showcases FHWA pavement resilience knowledge projects and outreach opportunities, as well as the dissemination of available knowledge on infrastructure resilience. This is going to be a series of technical webinars, workshops, and a tech brief, not only just on pavement resilience, but also infrastructure resilience more broadly. So be on the lookout for that, as well as the Pavement Resilience Knowledge Series. This is something that I'm spearheading that will give a general entry-level pavement resilience education for stakeholders. This is a series of primer documents focused on the first one's general pavement resilience. And hopefully this just helps build the state of knowledge and bridge the gap to the more technical projects that we'll be tackling in the future. The last is the FHWA Cooperative Agreement, Advancing Sustainability and Resilience in Pavements. We have a great project team that we're partnered with here to do all sorts of research on these topics. For resilience specifically, a lot of the research that's early has been informed on building off of the gaps in research needs in the FHWA Pavement Resilience State of Practice report. So if there's items in there that are noted as gaps, it's a possibility that these things could be addressed through this cooperative agreement. Next slide. Next, I want to go over a few FHWA resilience resources. I'm sure this is not comprehensive, such as the HEC 25 and 17 documents, the Vulnerability and Adaptation Framework, as well as the resilience pilots of state DOTs and NPOs. All great resources that I would implore you to go explore. Next slide. And next, these are a few resources for the Sustainable Pavements Program. First, FHWA, through the Sustainable Pavements Program, has a dedicated website for EPDs with the link here, as well as resources for the IRA Low Carbon Transportation Materials Program and others. Next slide. And then here we have more sustainability resources for the Sustainable Pavements Program. And these are divided based upon education, research, and deployment. It goes over everything Brian talked about today in terms of EPDs, LCA, recycling, green public procurement, as well as previous webinars, tech briefs, and other articles that we published. Next slide. And I'll just say thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. And I'm excited to hear some of your questions.
So we'll just wait for a little bit to see if we have any questions in the chat, or if anybody would like to unmute themselves and ask Austin and Brian a question directly. That would work as well. And thank you, Austin and Brian. This was very informative.
Yeah, we greatly appreciate it. I think there are a couple of comments posted in the chat. If you can read them out, Haley. Could you kindly share Flat Pavement Resilience Project output website, Austin and Brian?
Yes, I'm going to share our Resilient Pavements website in the chat. And when these have completed final review, so they should be posted soon. And when they are posted, they'll be posted to the section of the website for publications and multimedia. So I'll give you the website and just monitor over the next week or two. They should be up soon. So thank you.
Thank you, Austin. I think while we're waiting for others, please unmute and then please go ahead and ask. One question I have is, Austin, you mentioned sustainability, resiliency, two circles. There is a small overlap area. So our goal is to get that small area to become bigger and bigger, right?
I think it's context dependent. There are sustainability strategies and resilience strategies, but there are common strategies in terms of pavement design that may encompass both of those. I think my goal, and I'll take a first shot at this, Brian, is that we have a more cohesive understanding in terms of the infrastructure space, in terms of how we can best tackle both climate change impacts and climate change mitigation. I like to delineate these based upon a very simplified abstraction, which is that resilience is the impact of climate on pavements, and from an environmental perspective only, sustainability is the impact of pavements on climate. So if we could get more cohesive in terms of identifying these strategies, I think the list could grow. But I think the most important thing is that all of us on the sustainability and resilience space are just speaking the same language, whether it's pavement infrastructure or infrastructure more broadly. But that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, and I would echo that, it is context sensitive as to how that, what the goals are for, say, your program of agency's projects, or down to the project itself, what the goals are of that project are. So it really does depend on the context of what we're talking about as to what strategies that we're better defining and identifying now are to be applied to what projects, or to what extent over a portfolio of projects, or from a programmatic perspective. Looks like we have a question from Mohammed.
Yes, excuse me. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Hello, Doctor. Thank you very much for your explanation. It's really nice to see your work on resilience. I have a question. You mentioned like controlling the traffic on the highway or the pavement during after flooding or after events. But what other strategies that you are considering? Because I want also to ask how much is it different from the work of Professor Esha and Dave. He had some papers about using the system dynamic for controlling the traffic and whether it can sustain or not load. How much is it different, and what are the other strategies you are considering in your research?
Well, you've actually identified the model. This work actually was done by Esham Dave's advisor in part, Dr. Joe Sias. So that is the model. But essentially the philosophy is using a system dynamics model to determine a time where traffic can be safely applied again, where you can avoid adverse pavement impacts from just normal loading or even overloaded traffic loads. So, but that is the model you've identified.
Oh, okay. Okay, it's nice.
Thank you for your
It's
question.
nice to see it.
And you've been doing your research, so congratulations.
Dr. Perkins, go ahead.
Hello. My question is going to be for Austin. Can you share with the audience some more information regarding the trainee program with Federal Highway Administration? We do have on the call graduate students who may want to take that career path that you did, and give them some insight on what they would need to do and who they would need to contact, and in terms of your challenges and lessons learned since you've been a trainee.
Sure. Well, let me go from the beginning. So the Pathways Student Trainee Program is a federal government-wide training program, not just specific to FHWA. Now, FHWA actually has 2 different programs that if you're a student or a recent graduate, you can take part in. One is the student trainee program that I'm in now. It comes with a commitment to work at least part-time, but you can work up to full-time if need be. You don't have to be a graduate student. You can be undergraduate, graduate. At this point, I'm in my PhD, so I've been doing this since I was a master's student. This program is to be completed while you're still a student. Okay. And I'll say after you graduate with your degree, pending upon a successful recommendation from your direct supervisor, you can get placed within the agency you're working in. So in my case, placed within FHWA somewhere. The other program is the professional development program. This is very similar to other programs that are offered in the federal government for recent graduates. This program is actually to take you directly from undergrad or grad and go train with FHWA at different division offices for a period of 2 years, and then be placed in a division office if you're on the federal aid highway side. If you're on the federal land side of federal highway, which deals with the upkeep of infrastructure in the national parks and other federally owned facilities, there's also a similar training program with them where you'll be placed in either eastern, western, or central federal lands. A few caveats: you have to be a U.S. citizen. And unfortunately, I know that takes a lot of people out of competition for it, and you have to work at least part-time. I think those hours vary in terms of the minimum requirement, but that's between you, your supervisor, and if you have an academic advisor to work out the logistics of that. So, any questions on that point?
And just as a heads up, I dropped those links to those various programs that Austin mentioned into the chat, as well as a couple other links to some recently published tech briefs associated with some of the subjects that I talked about earlier. So, but yeah, we're happy to entertain any of those types of questions and put you in contact with the right folks if you're looking for those types of opportunities.
I will add to Brian put in the summer transportation internship program for diverse groups, or STIPDIG. That is another internship program that takes place in the summers. That's not the same as the student trainee program though, but that is another opportunity. But I'll put a link for the general student trainee program as well.
Thanks, Austin. Grab the wrong one.
No, it's okay. What you can do if you're interested is go on USA Jobs, where all federal hirings are posted, and search Federal Highway Administration student trainee internship. Those should bring up open positions for student trainee program, if that helps. So.
Very cool. I think we have time for one more question. Amit, you can go ahead and, yep, there you go.
Hi, Haley, this is Nipo. I'm actually sitting here with Amit. And again, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. So I am particularly interested in the funding opportunities. So I am a young faculty joining UMass Lowell. So can you tell a little bit more on the funding opportunity of the non-state DOT sources that you mentioned, and where I can find the additional information on that one?
Yeah, I can, the best place to start would be FHWA's Low Carbon Transportation Materials Grant Program website, which I can drop that link in the chat. And you can sign up for updates related to the program as they're announced, which will include once the notice of funding opportunity is released for non-state DOTs. And that's for that $800 million for local agencies and other entities that will have that opportunity. That will be also available through grants.gov, which is the more traditional means for these types of grant funding opportunities. But I'll drop that in the chat as well, both the LCTM website and grants.gov.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the session here. I just want to thank you again, Brian and Austin, for